Happy anniversary. Happy anniversary. 32 years ago today, President Clinton signed the National Voter Registration Act into law. The so-called Motor Voter Act, that's what it became known as, made common sense, yet unprecedented strides to registering more eligible Americans to vote. Imagine that, taking advantage of the fact that motor vehicle agencies and other state and local government offices that interact with Americans every single day can easily, efficiently, securely assist U.S. citizens with one of those most fundamental rights, registering to vote and participating in our elections. A little over 3 years after it was signed into law, on May 24th, 1996 more precisely, I proudly completed my own training as a deputy registrar in Los Angeles County, which qualified me to register voters in my own community. Now, nearly 2 decades later, I was sworn in as California's 30th Secretary of State, becoming the chief elections officer to the most populous and most diverse state in the nation. And just earlier this year, I was proud to become the ranking member of the Senate Rules and Administrations Committee with jurisdiction over federal elections. So it would be an understatement for me to say that I'm proud to bring my decades of election administration experience to the discussions and deliberations of this body. Now, throughout my time in public service, I've seen personally that one of the single greatest ways to increase not just civic engagement more broadly, but voter registration and voter participation more specifically, is to meet Americans where they already are. And Motor Voter sought to do exactly that, registering voters at state departments of motor vehicles and other public agencies, including state colleges and universities, military recruitment offices, and others. That's a good thing for our democracy, because we should all believe in that most basic of lessons that I believe we all learned in high school civics class, that our democracy works best when as many eligible people participate. Now, one other place that the National Voter Registration Act can and should extend to is naturalization ceremonies, giving new eligible United States citizens the information they need to register to vote should they want to. Now, if you've never had the opportunity to attend one before, I can tell you personally there are few experiences that give you more of that patriotic feeling than inside the four walls of a naturalization ceremony. If you've ever had doubts or questions about what it means to be an American, I encourage you to talk to and ask a newly naturalized citizen. Now, when I served as California Secretary of State, it was such an honor to speak at a number of these ceremonies, and part of the sacredness of the experience that I felt was standing up on the stage, looking out at the audience, and being told by the USCIS personnel how many countries were represented there. Maybe it was dozens of people, maybe it was hundreds of people representing literally dozens or hundreds of countries. So walking into the auditorium, walking into the convention center hall, they were immigrants from countries all over the world. But upon taking that oath and leaving that ceremony, they were all United States citizens. And while some people get to that point of naturalization having been in the country for a couple of years, some after several decades, some coming from working class families, others from very wealthy families, some families that have been here just a few years, others that have been here maybe multiple generations. Maybe some of these new citizens never had a chance to go to college or even high school. Others were there with not just bachelor's and master's degrees, but PhDs, maybe multiple degrees. The one thing that was constant for everybody is that as a United States citizen, you now had the right to vote. And in our elections, not only does every vote count, every vote counts equally. Think about that. How beautiful is that? Now, as I think about the people who go through the process, I can't help but also think about my parents, because they went through the naturalization process. And when I see the dozens or hundreds of immigrants becoming citizens, I envision what their preparation was like, because it was very similar, no doubt, to what my parents did. Taking classes, studying, showing up at every important appointment, filling out all those forms. And on the day they finally take the oath of allegiance, they earn the full benefits of United States citizenship. And so it was an honor and a privilege to be able to address those audiences as Secretary of State and encourage them not just to get involved in community, but to register to vote and exercise their new right to vote. And of course, I would do it on a nonpartisan basis. But the statistics tell us that registration amongst naturalized citizens still lags behind other voters. During the 2022 election, only 61% of naturalized citizens were registered to vote compared to 70% of native-born Americans. So the data tells us that we have a responsibility to do more here. And so that is why today I'm asking my colleagues to pass the Include New Voters in the Electorate Act, also known as the Invite Act. My bill would use the powers of the National Voter Registration Act to designate USCIS field offices as voter registration agencies, effectively giving our field staff not just the opportunity, but the duty to help new eligible United States citizens register to vote. Rather than just hand out a form, it would empower USCIS personnel to actually assist new citizens in completing and returning their voter registration forms. Now, I can predict what some of the counter-argument might be, so let me just say to everyone who regularly expresses concern about non-citizens voting, I would suggest, what better place to make sure citizens are registered than at a naturalization ceremony? With the flexibility to work with state and local agencies however they see fit, my bill would take those spaces that are so crucial to our democracy and turn them into catalysts for democratic participation. Because the responsibilities that come with citizenship don't end upon taking the oath of citizenship. That's just the beginning. So I urge all of my colleagues, Republican and Democrat, to join me in supporting this common sense bill to invest in and strengthen our democracy. So notwithstanding Rule 22, I ask unanimous consent that the Senate proceed to the immediate consideration of my bill, which is at the desk. I further ask unanimous consent that the bill be considered read a third time and passed, and that the motion to reconsider be considered made and laid upon the table.
An objection.
Madam President.
The senator from Utah.
Madam President, reserving the right to object, I want to thank my friend and colleague, the senior senator from the state of California, for his passion in pursuing what is itself a laudable goal, which is helping newly sworn in, newly naturalized U.S. citizens register to vote. But I've got no choice but to object to this unanimous consent request. This effort to pass it without further debate, without any debate today, want to point out that this is a bill that hasn't gone through any of the regular processes, and it's therefore inappropriate for us to consider it at this point. Look, the bill itself was just barely introduced. It hasn't had a hearing, hasn't had a markup before the Senate Judiciary Committee, on which we both serve, or otherwise, nor has there been any debate on this topic. Now, no doubt, it's important to make sure that our newly naturalized citizens have the opportunity to register to vote, but that puts the cart before the horse in many regards. If we haven't done our homework, we could cause problems. Now, no one disputes the fact, at least no one disputes the fact now, that there are, in fact, non-citizens voting in federal elections. And no one disputes that there are already laws on the books making it a crime for non-citizens to vote in U.S. elections. U.S. federal elections are for U.S. citizens and no one else, and it's a crime to do otherwise. Now, we've had some of these discussions over the last year, and in the months leading up to the 2024 general election, there were a lot of unsubstantiated claims made to the effect that non-citizens don't vote. We know now that that is not true. There are a number of documented instances from this last general election alone in which that happened. And this reflects the fact that we often do a poor job of making sure that non-citizens don't vote. On the current voter registration form, the federal voter registration form, there's just a little box that one checks for the applicant to indicate whether he or she is a U.S. citizen. Provided that he or she checks that box and later signs the form for a driver's license, that person can then obtain voter registration in the same state in which he or she has applied for a driver's license. And all we have to go on is that person's word as to citizenship. No one asks for documentary proof of citizenship. Now, one might ask, why? Why does no one ask for this, especially if it's a known problem? Well, this dates back to an interpretation of the 1993 National Voter Registration Act, the NVRA, also sometimes referred to as the Motor Voter Law. It was a decision by the U.S. Supreme Court that interpreted provisions of the NVRA as prohibiting the state officials administering that form, receiving that form, from asking for any kind of proof of citizenship. Now, that interpretation was, in my view, wrong. I agree with Justice Alito's dissent in that case, saying that the statute contains no such requirement. There's nothing in there prohibiting states from doing that. Nonetheless, that ruling stands, remains on the books today, prohibiting state officials, when receiving those forms, from doing any verification, requesting any proof as to citizenship. And that's why I last year introduced a bill called the SAVE Act that would amend the National Voter Registration Act to make clear what I believe was already clear, but that the Supreme Court got wrong, allowing state officials to request proof of citizenship at the time these documents are submitted, and setting requirements for that to happen. Now, the SAVE Act identifies and establishes and outlines acceptable documentation for proving citizenship, and it requires the states to set up alternative verification processes for citizens who don't have the normal, necessary, contemplated documentation, including for those instances, very, very common instances, in which a woman marries and thereafter changes her name to a married name, not evident on any birth certificate she may have. Now, when you contemplate the many dozens of women who support the SAVE Act in this chamber and in the other, and who voted for it in the other chamber, who were part of the process of drafting this bill, they and I and the others who were involved in its drafting, we all went out of our way to make sure that these documentation standards were not unduly onerous. In fact, if anything, they are less onerous than those requirements, those documentation standards that already exist in other areas of the law. Take, for example, labor and employment. Anytime any American citizen starts a new job as an employee, he or she is required to fill out a form called the I-9. The I-9 form requires an American citizen to provide proof of citizenship. And if you're not an American citizen, then you have to provide proof of your work eligibility, providing proof of your visa and the documentation that goes along with that. Now, just as it is true that married women who have changed their name to their married name, a married last name that is different than that found on their birth certificate, just as women every single day across this country are able to start a new job without that being an impediment, we made sure that the SAVE Act would leave things the same way. If anything, we made it easier in the context of casting this sacred, important vote and registering to become eligible to cast such a vote. The legislation, the SAVE Act, also compels states to purge non-citizens from voter rolls and establishes federal penalties for intentionally registering non-citizens to vote in federal elections. Over the last 4 years, many millions upon millions of illegal aliens have entered our country's borders. And of those, a non-zero but ultimately unknown number of them were improperly registered to vote. No one disputes that this is happening. They don't now, they did last summer, they don't now, because the proof is there, and it remains undisputed. At a time when trust in voting is as important as it's ever been, if not more so, we must stop any avenue for foreign election interference, and we need to pass the SAVE Act. Now, voting is both a sacred right and an important responsibility that accompanies American citizenship. And allowing the people of other countries who are not citizens of our country to violate the law and to access our elections and vote in our elections, contrary to law, is a grave blow to our security and our self-governance. The House of Representatives overwhelmingly passed the SAVE Act a few weeks ago, and now it's our turn to pass the SAVE Act, and that we must do. In light of the foregoing, Madam President, and in light of the fact that if we were to take a step like that, contemplated and proposed by my friend and colleague, and he is both the senior senator from California, without putting in place these additional safeguards that we need in the SAVE Act, safeguards that are no more intrusive than, and in fact, if anything, are less intrusive than, those already in existence in everyday events like starting a new job, I must object, and I hereby do object.
The objection is heard.
Madam President, thank you. I think I tried to make the point clear, while I respect where my colleague from the state of Utah is coming from. I just fundamentally disagree. The National Voter Registration Act, which this body passed on a bipartisan basis back in 1993, was designed to expand voter registration opportunities by making it easier for eligible Americans to register when they interact with government agencies. Plain and simple. And that's all this bill seeks to do by designating USCIS as a voter registration entity under the NVRA. And the point is simple, Madam President. When anybody goes to apply for a driver's license or a state ID, as you're filling out those forms, you do add name, date of birth, your address, you're signing all that same information for a driver's license or an ID that you're putting on the voter registration card or form when you're registering to vote. And yes, you do sign as to the accuracy of the information under penalty of perjury. So it's not just, check the box nonchalantly. You're signing under penalty of perjury, and there have been cases when people are charged with false registration or improper registration. So the laws are working. The instances of ineligible voters voting are very, very rare, but they happen. That means our laws are working. So we'll keep trying to work on the Invite Act, but I encourage my colleagues to think about not just the spirit of this proposal, but the context of the success of the NVRA over the last several decades. Thank you, Madam President.
The senator from Utah.
Madam President, we need to remember a couple of things. First, when someone has gone through the process of immigrating to the United States, they've completed a journey, perhaps a lengthy odyssey of moving to the United States, applying for and ultimately obtaining U.S. citizenship. They've provided a lot of documentation. They've done a lot of things to make that happen, and it would be an insult to those who are U.S. citizens, whether natural-born or naturalized citizens, to make it easy for people to cheapen that, to undermine it, to dilute that by coming in and saying, you know, I'm filling out my driver's license application, and all I have to do here is check a box. Check a box, sign my name saying, yeah, I'm a U.S. citizen. Well, you know, that's not an option in other areas where citizenship is required. It's absolutely not an option, for example, in applying for a passport, which is one of the documents that can be provided and often is provided when someone completes the process of filling out an I-9 and thereby establishing their work eligibility as a U.S. citizen. One of the forms that they can provide to help establish that is a U.S. passport. But regardless of what combination of identification they use, they do have to establish their citizenship. Why? Well, because that is the law. There are very good reasons why we have those laws in place to make sure that when someone starts a job, they're either a U.S. citizen or they have a visa with some type of work authorization in it. So it makes zero sense that for something as significant and important to the very foundations of our constitutional republic as the right to vote, that we could just so lightly cast aside the need to verify citizenship. When we go out of our way in other contexts, like starting a new job, to make sure that they prove it. So sure, yeah, my friend and colleague points out, when people fill out that driver's license application, they do have to check that box and they do have to sign their name, but why make it so that someone could lie? Especially when read against the backdrop of the Supreme Court ruling 12 years ago, concluding, wrongly in my view, but concluding nonetheless, and that decision's on the books, that not only did they not have to prove citizenship, but no state official, when receiving the driver license application form, may even inquire. Even if they have reasons to doubt, even if the person has admitted something, or otherwise, they can't ask. Even if there has been a wave in that state or in that area or across the country of non-citizens registering to vote, and that state wants to make a decision, you know, we really ought to provide some degree of documentation. They're not allowed to do any of that. So this is filling that gap, and it's important to do that. To that end, Madam President, notwithstanding Rule 22, I ask unanimous consent that the Senate proceed to the immediate consideration of H.R. 22, the SAVE Act, which is at the desk. I further ask unanimous consent that the bill be considered read a third time and passed, and that the motion to reconsider be considered made and laid upon the table.
Is there objection?
Reserving the right to object.
The senator from California.
Thank you, Madam President. I reserve the right to object, not for the first time on this proposed SAVE Act, not even for the second time on this proposed SAVE Act. This is an item that my colleague has brought up repeatedly here before the Senate. So I won't repeat the arguments and explanations that I've made in prior objections to the SAVE Act, but to suggest it is a solution in search of a problem. audit after audit, review after review, investigation after investigation has demonstrated that the instances of ineligible immigrants voting in elections is exceedingly, exceedingly, exceedingly rare, which again means our current laws are working. And to suggest that birth certificates be required for certain tasks when it's already secure, I don't make it a habit of walking around with my birth certificate in my pocket. A passport's another acceptable form of documentation for citizenship. Half the American public doesn't have a current valid passport because not everybody travels abroad on a regular basis. So they're unnecessary. Our current laws are working, and therefore I object.
And is heard. The senator from Utah.
Madam President, with great respect to my friend and colleague, the distinguished senior senator from California, he suggested that the SAVE Act, which merely requires some type of proof of citizenship when someone registers to vote in U.S. elections, that the SAVE Act is itself a solution in search of a problem. My friend also suggests that no documentary proof of citizenship is or should be made necessary, even considering the Supreme Court's ruling that states are not even allowed to request such documentation where they may deem it necessary. He suggests that this is the case because, as he puts it, the occurrence of non-citizens voting in U.S. elections is not only rare, but it's exceedingly, exceedingly, exceedingly rare, as he puts it. I don't know exactly what that means, but I do know that, taken to its logical conclusion, that same logical leap could and would lead us to all kinds of outcomes that we would never dream of. There are all sorts of things that may be rare by some standard or another. Sure, it's true that most of the people voting in U.S. elections are not non-citizens. And in fact, I would say that they would be a small minority of those casting votes, because most people here in the United States, most people voting in U.S. elections are, in fact, U.S. citizens. Taken to its logical conclusion, that would suggest that there's no need for TSA, which I'd be fine with for all sorts of reasons. But taken to its logical conclusion, that would suggest there's no need for you to identify yourself when you go through TSA, because instances of terrorism are exceedingly rare, or instances of people boarding an airplane in somebody else's name are exceedingly rare. Sure, that happens. Taken to its logical conclusion, it would also suggest that because instances of people starting a job, beginning employment in the United States as an American citizen, or as a non-citizen pretending to be an American citizen, are exceedingly, exceedingly, exceedingly rare, as he puts it, and therefore we should require no documentary evidence of either U.S. citizenship on the one hand, or work eligibility with a visa on the other hand. I could go on and on, but it is not an answer to the need for the SAVE Act, to the demand that 80+% of the American people agree with, which is non-citizens shouldn't vote in U.S. elections. It is not an answer to that demand, to that widely held bipartisan supermajority view. It's not an answer to that to suggest that because non-citizen voting is rare, we need not require any proof of citizenship, ever. Why? Well, there are so many reasons why, but here's the simplest one. When we make that easy, more people would do it. Some elections are decided by large margins. Others are decided by, to use his words, exceedingly, exceedingly, exceedingly small margins. We would be doing ourselves and the American people and the American Republic and the U.S. Constitution a grave, grave disservice, Madam President, if we didn't take that risk very seriously. Foreign election interference and meddling in our system is a real threat. We need to take it seriously. It's tragic and unfortunate. In fact, it's shameful that we haven't passed the SAVE Act. This is not the end of this issue. I'll be back. We'll get this passed. But between now and whenever we do get it passed, the American people are taking on a risk because of this body's unwillingness to act. And it's not this body, let's face it, it's members of this body on one side of the aisle and not on the other who are willing to incur this risk. That, tragically, is a sacrifice they're willing to make. We, tragically, are a sacrifice they're willing to make. Let's not let them continue to make it. Let's pass the SAVE Act. Thank you, Madam President.